Welcome, welcome, everyone. I am Sierra Kaler Jones, Executive Director of Rethinking Schools. Tonight is the official book launch, and it's also a celebration, y'all. So we want you to celebrate with us. This is the celebration and the book launch of our newest book, Science Teaching for Social Justice. And Science Teaching for Social Justice shares stories of educators and students who explore how social and political systems shape science. From preschool to graduate studies and across disciplines, this book contains lessons that empower students to use science as a tool for equity and justice. Illuminating methods to center social justice in science education, these stories help students go beyond the standards and dig into ways science is used both as a tool of oppression and as a means of liberation. So today you'll get a chance to hear from one of the editors of the book, as well as the contributors to the book, who will share highlights from the book, as well as what it means to teach science for social justice during these dire times. First off, thank you to our ASL interpreters. We have Crystal and Ryan on the call with us. We're so grateful. Thank you so much to the editors of Science Teaching for Social Justice, to Gretchen, to Liza, to Jana, and Jen for all of the work that went on behind the scenes to bring this beautiful and this powerful book to life. And as we dive into the conversation today, again, a welcome. Please add to the chat where you're joining from, why you're joining us this evening, what interested you in this conversation. We want to fill the chat box with lots of celebration because we are celebrating the book launch of Science Teaching for Social Justice. And I'm so excited to learn from our one of our editors of the book as well as the contributors. And so without further ado, I'm going to bring up our first panelist today is one of the editors, Gretchen Craig Turner. Welcome, welcome. Woohoo, the book is out. Celebrate. And so, Gretchen, as one of the editors for the book, can you tell us a little bit of the story of the book? How did it come to be? What have been a few highlights from the process? Can you take us into the book and share one of your favorite highlights?
Yes, I'll do my best. Thanks, Sierra. So thank you all for being here and for having me. I feel like this book has just been kind of brewing for a really long time. And I'm really excited to launch it out into the world. The idea really came from many people asking and wanting a book like this from Rethinking Schools, including those of us who ended up as editors. There is a pretty pervasive misconception that we need to teach scientific concepts separate from everything around us. And of course, that isn't true, right? So the authors of the articles in this book, and we have three of them here, and I see a couple in the participants list too, so thank you and welcome. The authors really demonstrate that science teaching can center social justice. We're looking at lessons and methods that bring in student voice and experiences, teach how science is used on both sides of injustices, and celebrate the joy and curiosity that leads to a love of science in all students. So a highlight of developing this book was really for me working with the editors, Liza, Jana, Jen, and Vera, who opted not to be named on the book, but was a real crucial part. We're just incredibly thoughtful people. And so we moved as a collective for almost all of our decisions of the book. We were deeply invested in compiling a collection of articles that is as thorough in both content and viewpoints as possible. So I think that's a big part of why it took us the better part of a decade really to put this together. We kept pushing to rework chapters and diversify the fields and courses represented, and to find and support educators with voices from a really wide spectrum of experiences. And the book doesn't fully represent voices we'd like to have, right? There are a lot of barriers that I just want to acknowledge that a lot of barriers for people to put their work out there, barriers that aren't equally distributed, and sometimes include safety concerns, right? So we know great science teaching is happening all over, and there's so many science educators that we really hope, and this is an invitation to anyone here who is interested in doing this. We really hope that you will have the time and space and safety and everything you need to write about your teaching and submit it to Rethinking Schools and maybe for a future edition of the book. So another big highlight that I just want to put out there too is working with the educators that are in this book was really pretty a phenomenal process. Some of them were first-time authors, which was really cool to get to interact and go through the whole writing process, which I think can be really intimidating. But also rereading and analyzing stories by educators that I've really admired for a very long time. I mean, it's fun, right? So I was also asked to share a highlight from the book, and this is from an educator I've looked up to for a very long time. She was a co-teacher of mine when I was in the Oregon Writing Project. And so this piece really exemplifies the idea of science teaching as a hopeful and a joyous practice. It's also a biology lesson, and I'm a biology and anatomy teacher, so my bias in relating to these lessons might be showing a little here. So these are some passages from Katherine Johnson's Celebrating Skin Tone, the Science and Poetry of Skin Color, which is just a beautiful article. It's in the last section of our book. So she here is teaching a pretty advanced theory to very young first and second graders, elementary students in this article. So in this passage, she is referring to why we see a gradient of skin colors. And I love how she breaks down the science and also how she taught it here. So she writes, "We created a word wall dedicated to words related to skin tone, melanin, tone, genetic, and heritage. All took places of prominence on the wall. Using the books and students' understanding, we wrote a kid-friendly definition of each term. We defined melanin as the stuff in your body that gives your skin and hair its color. Students came to understand genetics as the recipe for how one's body will be built. And after reading these books, my students stood on solid ground with some basic ideas. Skin tone has evolved over time. It is an adaptation to different environments, especially proximity to the equator. And everyone, regardless of how one's race is named or misnamed, is a shade of brown." The depth of science that she's talking about here, genetics, natural selection, evolutionary fitness being different in different environments, it's just so rich. And so she then uses mentor texts to inspire her students to write celebrations. So after teaching these really, again, complex ideas, she teaches them how to write celebrations of their own skin tone, which really deepens their understanding of the science here. So again, she writes, "We wrote for the rest of the week. Some days we cranked out longer sessions of 45 minutes of writing and sharing." Side note, 45 minutes with a first grader writing, that's phenomenal on its own. Okay, once or twice we simply squeezed in 20 minutes before lunch. For students who are ready to stretch as writers, I led a revision lesson on adding more detail to their metaphors. If students compare their skin to caramel, that caramel could become warm caramel or caramel inside a candy. First and second grade metaphors tend toward the cliche, but I wanted them to try and stretch their ideas. When students seemed satisfied with their poems, we created self-portraits. I let students pick the medium. paints or crayons that matched how they wanted their portrait to look. Poems and portraits hung in the hallway for several months, the students protesting whenever I wondered if it might be time to take them down. So here she's bringing in some methods that we don't think about as part of science teaching, right? So science teachers were sometimes afraid of doing things like bringing in poetry writing or portrait drawing, right? And about directly talking about student experiences around things like race. But I'm going to let Catherine's closing to this article close what I'd also like to say about the book, as this perfectly encapsulates how not shying away from such practices, which you'll see many other examples of in this book, leads to richer classroom experiences for students and teachers alike. So here's Catherine's words to close out my part of this. I know that children see and wonder about skin color. I know that children, even as young as 6, experience racism directed at themselves, their moms, their neighbors, their cousins, the man in front of them at the grocery store. I also know that opening my classroom to a discussion about the skin tone differences that we see and the ones that we ignore is one component to disrupting prejudice based on skin color. And I know that this is just the beginning. Sharing an experience around loving our skin tones does not suddenly take away the real pain of how the world sees white and black and brown skinned peoples. I plan to continue teaching in ways that might interrupt racist hierarchies and might do so joyfully. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. That's so powerful to think about all of the student experiences that are grounded in the book, how the methods that educators are using in the book and in their teaching are interdisciplinary, like you talked about using poetry and all of these other methods as part of the teaching strategies in science to be able to really speak to students in different ways and talk directly to their experiences, to be able to combat racism, to be able to combat injustice. And I love how you ended us in a place of hope and of joy. And we'll talk about that later, actually, because I have a couple of questions about the ending of the book that focuses on hope, joy, and action, which I love. So thank you so much, Gretchen. We appreciate you. And thank you for sharing those highlights and also about the process.
Thank you, Sierra.
I'm so excited to bring up our next guest. And that is Nicole Eford. And Nicole, I'm so excited to talk to you because I loved your interview. I love the work that you do with some of our youngest learners. And for our audience, for our community, Nicole was interviewed by Jen, who is one of the co-editors of the book. And there is a beautiful piece called Traditional Ecological Knowledge in the Preschool Classroom. And so, Nicole, I would love to hear from you. How does traditional ecological knowledge really expand how we think about science and how it's traditionally taught in the classroom?
Well, first, yo, Denali. I'm so excited to be here and thank you. Hey, Jen. Um, so I had never heard the term traditional ecological knowledge until 2019, and I had the opportunity to be a part of Wyoming Department of Education's Indian Education for All. And I have a background in fish and wildlife management. And so when I went into teaching, I just thought I was being super cool and having the best time of my life with these kids, with my pre-K babies outside, digging for salamanders and picking up hickory nuts, and just thought I was just super cool. And then Dr. Teresa Spoonhunter introduced me to the term, and I didn't realize at the time that it was starting to be a movement throughout Indian country, the traditional ecological knowledge, and teaching that alongside Western education. And so for me, once I learned what that was, then I kind of realized maybe I needed to organize that. And so naturally for me, um, I'd done it by season, what foods did Cherokee harvest? or eat during the fall? What did we do in the fall? What did we do in the winter, in the spring and summer? And so that became the guide for my curriculum. And in pre-K, I love it. I don't think I'll ever leave because they think everything you do is magic. And so when we would find a salamander or chase tiny frogs down by the pond, they're getting um, so much more. They're learning like seasonal. So when we get the frogs and we do the frog dance and how that correlates to the spring equinox, it just kind of all went together in this supernatural way. And it's turned into a whole curriculum for our pre-K program at Cherokee Elementary. And I'm pretty proud of that. So
I love that. Thank you so much. And I love how you're talking about the work with preschoolers and really starting with the land and starting with everything that's around them because they're naturally curious, right? They have so many questions and are trying to understand. And so I love how through traditional ecological knowledge, you're moving with the land and moving in community to be able to have these conversations with young people. Thank you
yes.
so much. I'm so excited to bring up our next panelist. Sam Long. And Sam, you have helped me so much through the many pieces that you've written for Rethinking Schools. And I'm thinking particularly about in Science Teaching for Social Justice, your piece about what is a family inclusive teaching about genetics and reproduction in K through 12 life sciences, because your work really helps students see the intersections between science, gender diversity, and inclusive teaching. So, can you talk about how you teach for justice in the biology classroom?
Yeah, thank you, Sierra. Well, I'm a high school science teacher and I've taught biology almost every year that I've been a teacher. And it was really in my first year of teaching that I was getting ready for this unit, getting ready for what we're about to talk about. And uh, I really felt that my identity as a transgender man, it's not something that I was going to be able to ignore or to put to the side, as nervous as I was about teaching this unit for the first time, uh, because I had an experience as a high school student. Um, Learning about life science, again, like Gretchen, I'm biased. It should be the most relatable thing that you learn about living things, including humans. And I had to learn all these rules and patterns in high school that I just didn't feel like applied to me. And I put my head down and went with it because I wanted to finish high school, but I didn't want to create that situation for other students. And I wanted for all my students to see that, well, my teacher here is talking about more diverse, more varied patterns that we can see in genetics and reproduction. And so that meant things like telling students there are different combinations of chromosomes that somebody can have, explaining the difference between your chromosomal sex and perhaps other indicators of sex and gender identity. And so when it went well in my first year, and I had students coming up to me and saying that they heard what I said and they appreciated to have a teacher uh, acknowledging that LGBTQ people are a part of biology, acknowledging that families, biological families are varied and diverse, acknowledging that genetics, uh, we know what we know about it, but it doesn't determine everything about somebody's body, behavior, their role in our society. And so I felt encouragement from the beginning, and um, it was an idea that I had in my first few years of teaching that um, I didn't really know if it made sense to bring this to other teachers. I didn't have teachers in my school that I really felt like saying, hey, I taught this thing about intersex. I think you might be interested in it. And one of the great things about this book launching is that I think there are a lot of teachers out there who they may not be surrounded by other educators who are talking about teaching science for justice every day, but I, they feel in their heart that this is not something they can leave behind in their journey as an educator. And so I started a group called Gender Inclusive Biology. One of the other authors in the book, Lewis Stellar, was my initial partner in that. We're still partnered in this process. And that's kind of how we got in touch with Rethinking Schools and had the opportunity to write this chapter about kind of the uh, different anecdotes and takeaways from trying to teach my students genetics. I've done it almost every year, trying to cover the idea of reproduction being an important part of evolution, but still acknowledging that there are individuals in any species that don't pass on their gametes, and what is their role in our population and our community. I feel that the diversity of gender and sex, just like any other form of biological diversity, it should be something that we're curious about. It shouldn't be something that we automatically pathologize what doesn't fit into a pattern. So we're just going to consider it a disorder. I don't think that is a helpful message to send students. And in the book, I talk about the students that I felt I wanted to give them a chance to integrate their understanding of their families and their identities. And there's one student who he has two moms, and he has openly talked about meeting his sperm donor. And he chose to do a project about androgenic alopecia or male pattern baldness. And he found that well, there is a genetic component. He was doing some reasoning with regards to, well, I'm 17 now, but am I gonna go bald early? I'm gonna go by what I know from um, both sides of my genetic family, and hearing him process that and seeing that I had been able to perhaps signal to him that this is a good place to process that, and this is a place where you're learning about science, but your experience in your family matters. You need to make sense of uh, your life, and science. My science class is not going to try to rewrite that for you, and I'm not going to try to get you to accept a pattern that doesn't actually apply to you. I learned a lot from seeing how some of my students process this. And every year, I've more students who respond in different ways and have different curiosities about well, learning about genetics. Almost everyone's interested about learning about genetics, so they may not feel they have the freedom to ask the questions that they want to ask. This year, I had a student teacher, and we were talking about this. Um, she definitely wants to honor all students and allow all students to participate. And we had a question about um, looking at traits within your family. And I said, hey, in this seventh period, I know that I have at least two students who are adopted. How do you think that this question could um, be revised to allow them to participate? And she's completely on board with this. But she also asked, like, is there a place in our computer where we can look up which students are adopted? And I that's where I paused and said, well, what if there's none? Can we still um, approach this in a way that has all students internalize that idea of was a difference between my social concept of family and my biological concept of who I'm inheriting my genes from. And I do think it applies to all students. And uh, in high school biology, I know that some of my students will go on to study science and some won't. And definitely every future doctor takes ninth grade biology. And so one thing that fills me with hope is that all of them, no matter who they're coming in as, come away understanding that genetics, maybe it's not as simple as they thought, and that language matters for including everybody. If you're gonna become a doctor that works with any population of people, that's going to include people for whom the genetic story might be a little bit more complicated. Maybe the questions that we ask and the way that we counsel people and work with people needs to change. And I think that starts with the youth and the needs that they're seeing. So I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute to science teaching for social justice. And I, working with Gretchen and having the opportunity to take a bunch of anecdotes and to find themes in them, something to share. I think back to, I guess initially I had questions of, is this even worth sharing? Is this even anything that a non-trans teacher would even think of or consider? But in talking with folks and working on the chapter, seeing just how important it is for everybody that's getting an education to feel included when they're learning about reproduction and genetics.
Thank you so much, Sam. That's so powerful and so important. And thinking about creating spaces that are inclusive for students to learn about themselves, about their experiences, about their families. And I wrote down something that you said. You said, your experience, your family matters. I'm not trying to get you to accept a pattern that doesn't apply to you, as you were talking about your conversations with students. And that stuck out to me because when I think about science teaching for social justice and what you all have highlighted so far is thinking about how do we come from a place of curiosity, of inquiry and wonder and ask why are things the way that they are. And so you have shared just really powerful examples of what that can look like in the classroom and in the community. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Next up, I am excited to welcome Kimmy Waite. And Kimmy, you have an incredible piece in the book, Action Research for Environmental Justice in the Kindergarten Classroom. And so, could you talk about what it means and what it looks like to teach science for social justice with younger children at the elementary level?
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for the editors for selecting my piece to be in the book. And I'm a really longstanding fan of Rethinking Schools and the Zen Education Project. And just very inspired hearing all of the pieces from the contributors so far. So thank you. So I'm Kimmy Waite. I'm currently an assistant professor at Cal State LA. However, I'm a former kindergarten teacher and also a district curriculum specialist in Compton. So my K-12 experience has been with primarily Black and Brown communities in South Los Angeles. So my piece was in the Rethinking Schools magazine, I believe in 2022, and it inspired my book. So thank you to Rethinking Schools for pushing my thinking and then also for helping me refine my practice for environmental justice. So I guess before I talk about that, I think I would be remiss before mentioning two really significant events in Southern California in the past several weeks about environmental racism and environmental justice. There was the industrial incident in Orange County in a primarily Vietnamese community. And then also currently in Boyle Heights, where my university is kind of located by predominantly working class Latinx community. So I think, as the panelists had mentioned, just how you can't separate the lived experience from the reality, whether that's science or environmental injustices. I think they're always very closely connected. And as the other panelists mentioned, young learners is a great place to start. So my piece, Action Research for Environmental Justice in the Kindergarten Classroom, This was inspired by my time teaching kindergarten in South Los Angeles. And one thing that my students primarily picked up on is their surroundings. And we know how observant, 5 and 6 year olds are, always noticing things. And they would always frequently comment on the lack of green space in their schoolyard and in the neighborhood, and then just the extreme heat in the summers, particularly in August and July. August and September, rather. So, I mean, these students are 5 and 6, but already they can see, something in my lived reality is different than what I see on TV or, what I see in the media, specifically, like the lack of urban green space and then also the heat and then pollution. So, for my practice, whether it's kindergarten students or working with teachers or undergraduates, I think teaching about environmental justice is getting students to recognize that it is a lived experience. Environmental racism or environmental injustices is a lived experience, and you can use data and science to help create solutions. So in my piece, my students were noticing again the pollution, lack of green space, and air quality. So I really wanted to go beyond kind of like this green status quo. And I think elementary is I would say, a bad offender in this because a lot of the times when we talk about, oh, environmental education at elementary, it's always the recycling assemblies, the, plastic challenges, the green superhero kind of things. And I think it's important to shift that to the lived experience. So my students, they became researchers. So students as young as 5 and 6 can become researchers with some different tools. So they used some geography-based apps. So if you're familiar, Cal Screen is kind of like a GIS based program where you can look at literally the data on environmental pollution and environmental racism. So there used to be the national app on this through the EPA before Trump cut it. But basically, you look at the population data and the pollution data, and it overlaps. And then so children as young as 5 and 6, they can see, okay, I see the key here. Where there's a higher pollution index, it's a different color. Where there's lower pollution, it's a different color. And if I look at different areas by, Beverly Hills versus Compton, I can see obviously one has a higher pollution concentration and one does not. So my students use this app, and because it's color coded, they're 5 and 6, but they could clearly see, oh, our community has more pollution than Beverly Hills, and they made a bar graph comparing different cities with the real data. So again, they're 5 and 6. And then using writing, they communicated their findings to the principal, and then we also wrote the school board and city council. So having students have access to real geography data, I think is really important. And then there's also some great air quality apps, like citizen science apps students can use that might be of interest to like the biology teachers or environmental science. The Air Now mobile app, and then also IQ Air Visual. So using different apps and programs to get students to actually take the data, the real data, and then, see how does this fit with my experience. And my students also realized that, we don't have a lot of shade in the schoolyard because of the lack of green space. And when I walk down the street, I smell a lot of bad smells because of the pollution. And sometimes, if there's an incident at a very close factory, I can feel my eyes kind of water a little bit. So I think getting students to use real data and practice critical thinking when they're young and then just observing are the main takeaways from my piece. But I do really appreciate the points that the others have made too about how the injustice is a lived experience and science can be used as a tool for liberatory purposes, even though it hasn't always been that way. So thank you very much, and thrilled to contribute to the book.
Thank you so much. I wrote a couple of things down that you said. You said you can use data and science to track problems and create solutions. So that's something that I'm sitting with, as well as the individual versus the structural and systemic when you were talking about the recycling assembly. And I think oftentimes in school, students learn that it's in sort of an individual thing that you can just recycle or you can use less water when you're brushing your teeth, but not necessarily thinking about the larger patterns. And so I love how you're using data and research to be able to support those conversations. So I'm going to bring back all of the panelists so that we can be in celebration together. This is kind of like our virtual kitchen table talk. And first and foremost, after hearing you all, and of course, after reading your pieces, I want to go back to school so I can be in all of your classrooms and experience these incredible lessons. And I'm so grateful that you wrote them up for Rethinking Schools and for the book Science Teaching for Social Justice. One of the themes of the book is how science can be used as a tool for oppression, but also as a tool for equity and justice. So I'd love to pose to all of the panelists, can you share your experiences, whether that be in the classroom or in your daily life, where you've really seen science as either reinforcing social and political systems or an experience where you've seen science being used as a tool for justice?
I
Um,
can go ahead and start.
yeah.
One area of genetics where uh, it's been a tool used for oppression is pedigrees. If you look at why our pedigree is a thing, this to students it looks like sort of a family tree, but of symbols, and they're shaded in, and there's notation to show where what traits people had, and you're supposed to figure out how that was inherited. But that was uh, historically one of the most famous places it was used was by Nazis to determine how much Jewish blood is in a family. And also, it was used in peerage, British peerage tables to determine who has this much nobility, who outranks who in this family, and it outed some of the early transgender people in those aristocratic societies because one peerage would have changed their name and gender and one didn't. And so this is something that I noted in my writing for the book that it troubled me that this was something that was often in the standards. Students need to know how to read a pedigree. And if they've learned it before, they'll tell you, "Oh, I learned it in eighth grade." It's a skill, but a skill to what end? Um, so I looked into it further, and there are a lot of genetic counselors, family counselors, and geneticists who have come up with symbols to represent more accurately the diverse families that they would work with, that they would counsel through. Um, Symbols for what do you do if you have a trans person who has had a biological child? How do you show that somebody is adopted? How do you show the variation that we already know exists? And for me, for my students, the most important thing was that they see the diversity as having a right to exist. It's not our job to fit into a very rigid table that's only been used for oppression, not only for oppression, but this is a part of its history. And how do you empower more students to talk about their families, their stories of reproduction that don't necessarily fit into historically how these tables have been used? Fortunately, the reading a pedigree table, it's no longer in the next generation science standards, but it can be used as a way to make predictions, a reason about traits of offspring. And so it's still in there in some way. Um, I see students who, if they're given tables or if they're asked to draw tables, their reaction to that is much different from, say, one year, instead of having them make the pedigree table, I had them make a stop motion animation of meiosis, the process of the sex cells dividing. And I noticed that when you have a more flexible, more open format, um, this seems to pair a little bit better with the diversity and the flexibility of families that are a part of our society. And so by taking away the pedigree, but keeping the idea of representing reproduction or representing chromosomes, this allowed students to see it in a more a broader way. And I know that students who, if they go to become a genetic counselor, they probably will need to be very familiar with pedigrees. But I feel that I've started them off with a broader look at what families can be.
Thank you. Nicole, I saw you take yourself off mute.
Um, One thing for us in Indian country is has been like the exclusion of indigenous knowledge from the science curriculum. Um, it's often presented Western science as the only valid way of knowing, while our indigenous knowledge systems have been dismissed as folklore, culture, things of the past, or just tradition, rather than a sophisticated system of observation and understanding. We've charted stars and weather patterns and animal migration and medicine plants. And so, it feels like it's contributed to the marginalization of indigenous peoples and has sent a message to our students that our communities are consumers of knowledge rather than producers of it. And so incorporating more traditional knowledge and building that curriculum has been important to kind of fight that battle.
Thank you. Gretchen, may I turn to you next?
Yeah, I mean, I just listening to Sam and also Nicole, um, I think something that we think about uh, is just naming our student experiences. Um, I've learned a lot from Sam and have changed my vocabulary in how I teach genetics. It's uh, really been an interesting process because, scientists, we're obsessed with things like accuracy and precision. And he really flips this from being just about uh, identity to being really more scientifically accurate, right? And so that's, I think, a really exciting use of science as a tool for justice is that when we get actually accurate about what's happening, um, a lot of the prejudice and um, constructs that we've built around things um, kind of fall apart, right? Like, there's not biological race. Biological gender is a tremendous spectrum, So um, I think just seeing how we can really lean into that sort of accuracy is kind of an interesting way of thinking about bringing then justice into the classroom. And Nicole, I really appreciate what you're saying about um, Western viewpoints and hierarchies and how much we miss, right? When we do that and when our curriculum only focuses on one way of knowing. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I'm just kind of repeating what really resonates with me and what I think about a lot as a biology teacher.
Yes. Yes, no, that was perfect. Thank you. Kimmy, may I turn to you next?
Yes. So I think just like upholding the green status quo, and as you mentioned, the very individual actions versus the larger systemic problems, I think contribute to science being used as a tool for injustices. Like for example, the people's curriculum for the Earth from Rethinking Schools was like one of the first books I ever read as a teacher on environmental injustice and climate change, and it was just like so amazing to me. So I think we need more things like that in teacher prep programs. So we can change how like teachers also begin to think about this, moving from just like an individual, oh, you can recycle to a larger, like, well, what are the larger systems of oppression that like contribute to this? And I know Dr. Max Liboron is one of my favorite academics related to this. What is it? Discard studies, I think, was their one of their works, and they speak about how recycling is like the gangrene on a larger issue because recycling is used as a distraction from the larger systems that are at play behind this. So I'll put it in the chat, their work, but they're one of my favorite academics related to that, and also using indigenous knowledge as well.
Thank you. I appreciate you all. One thing that each of you touched on in different ways, shapes, or form as you were talking about, and also one of the themes of the book, and actually the last section of the book is titled Teaching Science for Hope, Joy, and Action. And so, what does that mean to you? How can educators teach science for hope, joy, and action?
I can start on this one. Um, in terms of the action piece, uh, something that I've been really focused on over the last few years has been highlighting resistance. So when I teach and talk about injustices in science and how science has been used to perpetuate um, all kinds of terrible things, right? Uh, Bringing in how people who are targets have been resisting has actually really shifted the conversation in my class. It's something that I wish I had done earlier in my career, and I did not do a good job of earlier in my teaching. Uh, but I learned about how I needed to do this by talking to previous students about lessons. There's actually interviewed some students about my USPHS study for untreated syphilis. Sorry, the name is so long, I get it all tangled. And realized that what the kids are taking away was not what I wanted to leave them with. But yeah, I think that's really where like the justice and the hope and the activism can come from, is by really highlighting and really focusing on resistance movements within a lot of the injustice. I mean, like I'm hearing Kimmy talk about, you know, students noticing the differences in neighborhoods in terms of pollution, right? And then she teaches them like what can be done about it. You know, that's resistance, and that's pretty cool.
I love that. Kimmy, might I turn to you next?
Yes, and apologies, I was putting my the reference in the chat. Let's see. I think there's also, I think, joy in finding solutions. And I think it's empowering to give students the tools they need to empower themselves with knowledge and data. So I think by giving students tools for like self-empowerment that they can use to take action for their own reality and like to help transform their own reality with the tools that we give them, I think is really powerful. Like for example, when I was teaching kindergarten, learning or teaching students how geography and GIS can be used as a tool to understand some of these environmental injustices, I think is really powerful. And then seeing like that aha moment when they realize, oh, this is why it is the way it is. And it's not just me, like I'm not bad. I'm not, I don't live in a bad neighborhood. It's not my fault. This is like a larger kind of issue we're dealing with. So I think there can be joy in kind of reclaiming that narrative once they have the tools and the data to like articulate what their reality is.
Love that. Thank you. Nicole, may I turn to you?
Yes. So I've thought about this question. Like, I love this question. So I think I want to take it back to my teachers at school because I love it. And so I really thought about it in three parts. Um, Teaching for hope to me means helping our students recognize that they can make a difference, like empowering them to know that they are capable of great things. Um, Teaching for joy, for me, especially in the pre-K room, means nurturing their curiosity and their wonder and making sure they stay connected to the natural world. And then teaching for action, I feel like that means giving students opportunities to apply what they've learned and um, to apply the learning to authentic issues in their schools and their communities, um, and to serve there.
Beautiful. Thank you. Sam.
One thing that Kimmy said really resonated with me, giving tools for self-empowerment. And when it comes to genetics or talking about bodies or families, the most empowering thing that you can have as a student is the language that you need to describe your experiences. Gretchen kind of talked about this when we teach a really simplified and cut and dried language like women have ovaries, all women have ovaries, all men have testes. Um, when we think about who this is excluding, and for no reason. There are women who don't have ovaries. There are trans women and non-trans women. There are other things that you can say. You can say when you're teaching about or teaching or learning about reproduction, you can say, well, ovaries produce egg cells, testes produce sperm cells, and having that language and not having to fall back on these unnecessary associations with gender. Um, I feel that this empowers students because they can advocate for themselves without feeling like they're trying to ask for an exception for themselves. Nobody wants to say, "Well, I want to ask for you to say it differently because of me." No, I need you to say it differently because it's scientifically accurate, and you don't know who you're gonna encounter as a healthcare professional who's really going to appreciate that when you use inclusive language and show them that they're welcome in that space.
Thank you. You all are giving me a lot of hope, and I'm thinking, just sitting with what you were sharing about Kim, you were talking about finding solutions and data to articulate. Sam, you're talking about language. And in the work that I get to do with young people, doing community-based participatory action research as we go through the process of even thinking about the different types of data that we could collect. And students start to collect data about their own lives and their lived experiences, whether that be oral history testimonies from their loved ones or other data that they're interested in diving into. They have this moment where they're like, wait a minute, I have data. I can collect data, right? Because the data seems to be this sort of outward thing that only appears in textbooks or in scholarly websites. But then when they start to understand that they have data, they collect data, their lived experiences are data. It helps to sort of break down some of those barriers, like you all were talking about, some of those hierarchies in science that kind of presses it away from our personal experiences. And so, as we move into the final parts of our conversation, what advice do you all have for teachers who want to center justice in their classrooms but don't know where to begin? Of course, we are in dire times where educators are being terminated, they're being doxxed for having these conversations with students about justice. And so, what advice might you give to teachers who are trying to center justice, but they're just trying to figure out where should they start?
I think finding your community, I think, is so important. For myself, when I was a kindergarten teacher, I became a teacher like in a leadership position after that, before going into academia. But I think whether you're a teacher or an academic or a teacher leader, I think finding your community is so important, especially in these very troubling times. And that your community can be teachers in your school, your district. I know Rethinking Schools and the Zen Education Project, they host these fantastic like teacher community movement building spaces, and I really found community in that, because I was very much alone in the work I was doing when I was a teacher. And like Sam, I felt like, do people need to know what I'm doing? Like should other people know? And I think it's also finding your community and realizing the work you are doing is important, and that there's people that want to connect also.
And to add on to that, there's you don't if you feel based on the school that you're in, the environment that you're in, um, if you don't feel it's the right time to raise this big flag that says I'm teaching for justice, um, small things can have a big impact as well. An example that comes to mind is that talking to a group of high school students about um, sex versus gender, just so that they have the right language to go into their genetics unit. Um, this is going to help the students who need to hear it the most, and it's going to plant a seed in them. And it doesn't need to be something that you are saying everybody in my school needs to do this. It can be something pretty small, and that's the mindset that I had in the first year that I was teaching. I said, I'm gonna talk about the idea of sex and gender and see how it goes. The only thing I was hearing back was warmth from students, hungering for an acknowledgement of these ideas in science. And I think you'll find a lot of that hunger in students when you're talking about any sort of justice in science, because they they can recognize when they have a teacher who is just going to teach them the facts in science, and a teacher who is going to really view science as a tool for change in the world.
I'm going to add on to what Sam was saying, and uh, I think for me, just a couple of things really kind of help. Uh, One is just to really look at what injustices your students are actually facing. Um, I teach in a school that has a fair number of undocumented students, and this is a really scary time. Um, and so when we learned about the reproductive system and anatomy, we read articles about forced sterilizations and the history and how that's happening in ICE centers and how it's part of a pattern, right? A pattern of eugenics movements that include what we're seeing right now, right? And I think just not looking away, but really trying to see what your students are facing uh, is a good place to figure out what to center and to talk about. Like what Sam's saying is, um, kids really are eager to talk about this stuff. I mean, I think kids of all ages, and I teach high school, so I see this for sure with my high schoolers. They have an incredible sense of justice, of right and wrong. They see it. If you can bring that in to your science lessons, like you get them hooked in a really more in-depth way. But it also, I mean, these aren't injustices, and oftentimes that I personally face, right? So then educating myself is really important, trying to stay on top of reading and listening to, NPR and podcasts, and reading what other people are writing about and rethinking schools, right? Like all of that just is really important so that you um, know how to talk about those things too.
Nicole?
I think the biggest thing for me, my advice would um, be get to know your community. Um, just learning who you're serving, the voices that are represented in the curriculum, and whose are missing. And I like what Sam said about taking those small steps because it doesn't have to be just like one lesson or one activity that is justice centered, but it's really about creating experiences throughout the year that help those students continually ask meaningful questions and recognize their ability to make positive changes, like just one thing at a time, and how significant that can be, what an impact that can be over time.
Amazing. Wow, I've learned so much today, and I've loved getting to hear some more about the stories behind the pieces, more about your approaches to science teaching for social justice, thinking about everything from different methodologies for teaching science, like Gretchen was talking about, the different ways that we can reach out to students and bring their experiences into the classroom, to the importance of centering Indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge and being grounded in the land and being grounded in the community, as Nicole was talking about. I'm thinking about what you said, Kimmy, about finding joy in solutions and data to be able to articulate reality, and Sam, the power of language, but also about diversity as a right to exist. I have so many notes here. I won't go through all of them because I have so many, but just wanted to lift up a few of the powerful words that you all have shared with all of us. And for that, I'm so grateful. And as we get ready to close out our time together, just thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists and ASL interpreters. Thank you to Crystal. Thank you to Ryan. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, Kimmy. Thank you so much to the editors of the book, of course, Gretchen, Liza, Jana, and Jen. And a few things that I'll share too, just so that you all know what's coming up. First and foremost, we got to celebrate this book just a little bit more because it's so amazing. So if you haven't gotten your copy of Science Teaching for Social Justice, we invite you to do so. If you want to order copies for your school, for your district, we would definitely be happy to be in conversation with you about how to do that and some bulk discounts. So make sure you get your Science Teaching for Social Justice. Also, if you're not already subscribed to Rethinking Schools magazine, we are the nation's leading grassroots publisher for racial and social justice and education. You can get a subscription or you can give a subscription. We do have options to gift a subscription. Our summer issue is going to be hitting mailboxes any day now. And as we put in the chat, Gretchen did review Kimmy's new book, and that will be in the new issue. So make sure you get subscribed so you can get a copy of the issue to learn more. And it is our 40th anniversary at Rethinking Schools, which is no small feat, just to think about this current socio-political moment. And one of the reasons why Rethinking Schools is still standing is because of all of you, because of your support. So please, please, please help us give voice to more educators, and please consider a donation. Every resource, every dollar counts in supporting us. Mark your calendar because next month we have something new. We have the Teach and Organize series, which will be a new quarterly workshop and exchange. It'll be a free online public opportunity to learn teaching and organizing strategies and cultivate community. So we'll get a chance to hear from an educator about a teaching practice or an organizing practice. And then you get to go into breakout groups and you get to meet each other and talk to each other. So keep a lookout for more information there. And lastly, Rethinking Schools co-coordinates the Zen Education Project with Rethinking Schools. Make sure to check out our events calendar and the Zen Education Project event calendar for all of our Teach the Black Freedom Struggle events that are happening in the fall. Other than that, again, thank you all so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We appreciate you. And we will send a follow-up email in the next couple of days with a recording as well as additional resources from the conversation. Again, thank you all so much. I appreciate you. I appreciate the panelists, the contributors, and Gretchen, you as editor, and the editors who are also in the Zoom room with us as well. Thank you for this work. Thank you for this book. It is so needed. It's so necessary. And I am really excited about getting it into the more hands of even more educators. Thank you all.